Welcome to the Fourth and Goal Fantasy Football Podcast. And now, the nerd of the North, the ace of analytics, the seeker of the sleepers. He's your host, Micah Tweetin.
Hey everyone, it's Micah Tweetin, the senior fantasy football writer at Purple PTSD, and welcome to the second episode of the Fourth and Goal Fantasy Football Podcast. Today we've got a full plate as we're going to go through running backs. I'm going to kind of go through my top 10 running backs and why I have them where I have them. So to start off that list, we're going to go through and touch on my running back that's on the top of the list, and I'm sure he's on the top of everybody's list, and that's running back David Johnson. Now, David Johnson is the number one running back for a reason. For me, he's literally checking every box as we go along, especially when you compare him to my number two running back, Le'Veon Bell. In 2016, David Johnson had about 75% of the market share for carries, which while that may seem low for a starting running back, 75% was the highest by far of any running back in the NFL last year. Todd Gurley might have been a closer second than I think. But he projects to get about 350 touches this year, which would be about 280 rushing and then another 70 receiving targets, which would be equivalent to a wide receiver 3. So when you draft David Johnson, not only are you getting a running back 1, but you're getting a wide receiver 3 with that. So it's like you're playing an extra position compared to your opponents. So it's definitely a added bonus with that. But last year he ran for 1,200 yards and caught for almost 900, which is incredible. But the Cardinals this offseason have already said that they're aiming to get him to the 1,000 club, meaning 1,000 rushing yards and 1,000 receiving yards. And if that's the case, that would be truly remarkable. Bruce Arians has kind of said, there's not a thing as too many targets for him since he's this young, which, take that with a grain of salt. But the point being, they're not going to go back on the amount of targets and the usage he's getting in that offense any less. Last year, he had 58 targets in the red zone, which was the most for any running back or any wide receiver in the entire NFL. And he was pretty efficient with that, scoring 20 touchdowns on the year. Now, he's obviously not going to score 20 touchdowns again this year, but that's not to say, he's still going to get that red zone target usage, and he's still kind of the go-to guy there in the red zone for them. So he'll still, you can still count on him to get quite a few touchdowns this year. Now, in terms of fantasy production, one of my favorite metrics that I've liked to calculate is game-to-game consistency. So the way I look at that is I go and look at all of the games for the season and calculate the standard deviation, and then add that standard deviation to the weekly total. And that will give me, so say David Johnson averages 14 and say standard deviation is 5, that gives me 19. So then any game that he scores above 19, I bring it back down and make it into 14. So if he scores 34, it only counts as 14. So it's a way to calculate kind of what are the baseline points that I can depend on him week in and week out to get. And for his consistency rating, he got 14.5%, which was by far one of the best of any fantasy player, let alone any fantasy running back in the league. Le'Veon Bell was another one that was pretty consistent, and he had 18%. And so that gives me a good idea that not only is, David Johnson explosive, but he's consistently explosive with his points, and I can depend on a high amount of points coming from him each week. I don't have to worry about him like a Julio Jones, where, 1 week he'll score 2 and the next week he'll score 35. With David Johnson, it can be like 1 week he'll score 12 and the next he'll score 22. And he has the possibility of still getting up to 35. For me, that was a really big key to David Johnson as well in deciding between Johnson and Bell. But if that doesn't sound good enough, it only gets better. David Johnson has the 7th easiest schedule for running backs this year, whereas, if you're looking at Le'Veon Bell, he's got like the 31st schedule. David Johnson is starting to slowly pull away from Le'Veon Bell here for the 1-2. Now, David Johnson is a slight injury risk, as kind of every running back is, but he's also a significantly less injury risk compared to my next 3 on this list, which are Le'Veon Bell, LaShawn McCoy, and Melvin Gordon. Now, every game of David Johnson last year, but the last game of the season, was a running back 2 game or better. In that, he's in the top 24 running backs for fantasy production that week. And the only reason he wasn't the last week was because he got injured in that game. But every other game he was running back 2 or better, and in 12 of those 15 games, he was a running back 1 production, or one of the top 12 running backs each week. That is an incredibly consistent and incredibly good statistic that we haven't seen for quite some time. So for David Johnson, he's good. He's consistently good. He gets a lot of targets, and he's in a high-powered offense. And the team underperformed last year in terms of wins and losses based on where you'd have projected them to be based on their statistics. And so, if they're closer in games, longer, and if they're ahead in games, you might even say David Johnson might even get a little bit more in terms of targets and carries and usage in that offense if they're ahead, and that's what the game script is calling for. So he definitely has a lot of potential there at number 1, not only as a good floor but as a good ceiling as well. But now let's move on to my running back number 2, which is Le'Veon Bell. So before Ezekiel Elliott's suspension, it was kind of, you've got running back 1, 2, and 3 of Johnson, Bell, Elliott, and that was kind of the big 3 for running backs. Now Elliott is suspended for 6 games, and that was just Friday that came out. And so now you've kind of got the two-headed monster at running back with Johnson and Bell. So, as much as I like LaShawn McCoy, Le'Veon Bell is the clear number 2 here, just because of targets and touches and offensive potential. One of the things you look for with fantasy production is the ability of the offense, and if it's a high-powered offense, you're probably going to lean more towards them than, a slow offense that may not make it to the red zone very often, because the amount of times you get touches in the red zone matters, because that tells you the potential for touchdowns as well as potential for big plays, big games, that kind of thing. Le'Veon Bell is obviously in a really good situation for that on the offense, with Antonio Brown and Ben Roethlisberger as well. But he faces the 31st schedule for strength of schedule, so the second hardest schedule for running backs this year. As always, he's a pretty big injury concern. I don't think there's been a season yet that he's played all 16 games, whether that's from suspension or injury or whatever. But there's a pretty good likelihood that at least a time or two he's going to be, questionable or whatever for the season. I love using Sports Injury Predictor. They give you a good idea of what the odds are a player is going to land on an injury report at any point during the season, whether that's probable or questionable, doubtful, out, whatever it is. They give you, kind of the percentage of what are the odds based on the history of injuries they've had in the pros and in college, and whether or not a player's risky or not. I don't, it's not like I'm going to be like, oh, well, one guy's got 85% and the other guy's got 75. I'm going to go with the 75. But it's a good idea. It's a good way to, kind of tell, is this player risky in terms of injury or not? For Le'Veon Bell, they give him an 85.3% chance of landing on the injury report at any point in the season. Now, again, that could just be probable, but 85% is ridiculously high. In fact, I think that might be the highest number for any player in the NFL this next year, according to their metrics. So that's to say Le'Veon is an injury risk. He's definitely an injury risk and something you have to kind of be wary of and look out for. But the potential for Le'Veon Bell is so good. He only played 13 games last year and still was up in the David Johnson range. In fact, he was more efficient than David Johnson last year. So you could say, if he gets a full 16 games this season, he really could finish as running back 1 this year. He gets the targets in terms of receiving. He gets the touches, running the ball. He carried the ball for 65% of their carries last year. And again, that was with him being out 3 games. You look at him again this year, he's probably going to get about 325 touches, both running and receiving the ball. He gets the ball 33% of the time in the red zone. He got 33 touches last year. So there's definitely the upside in the red zone. He's efficient when he gets into the red zone, scores a lot of touchdowns, and he has a high market share. So there's not a lot that you don't love about Bell besides the injury risk, as well as the tough schedule for him this year, which, strength of schedule in the preseason is always it may not be the most accurate thing in the world, but it at least gives you an idea of how difficult the schedule is going to be. It's not like he's going to have a cakewalk for a season unless something were to go wrong for all the teams that he's facing. But, he's the clear-cut running back number 2 for me. And it comes down, again, just targets in an offense that's high-powered and opportunity. There's not much more you can say about him, I guess. So with that, let's move on to my third running back, which is LeSean McCoy. Now, LeSean McCoy, I think, benefited from this weekend's trade with the Bills and the Eagles and the Rams, giving up Sammy Watkins to Los Angeles and getting back Jordan Matthews from Philadelphia. I don't understand that necessarily, besides, I guess, the draft pick side of things. Jordan Matthews is known for having some of the worst hands in the NFL for a wide receiver 1. But that helps, I guess. What it takes away from Tyrod Taylor, I think it adds into LeSean McCoy. They've been run heavy in the past, and I think they're going to continue to be run heavy in the future. Tyrod's not going to have his target of Sammy Watkins when Sammy Watkins was healthy, I suppose, but he's not going to have that reliable target like that. I think Zay Jones might fill in nicely there. But LeSean McCoy should be a benefactor of that trade in terms of production. Again, you're going to see high touches from him. You're probably going to see that 300 range in terms of receiving and rushing the ball. They ran the ball in terms of pass-run ratio. The Bills were one of the most run-heavy teams in the NFL last year, and they're projecting to do the same again this year. So, again, high target, high opportunity. Mike Gillislee left for New England this offseason, and Gillislee was kind of the one that was stealing a lot of LeSean McCoy's touchdowns down in the red zone. And he still may lose some of those, but he should get a few of those back. Gillislee was extremely efficient when he was in the red zone last year and one of the most efficient running backs in the entire NFL. So losing him, again, was a big help to Shady. Now, with targets, he got 38 targets last year. I would expect maybe a little more than that this year. Was pretty efficient with that. And consistency-wise was better than Le'Veon Bell at 17.31%. So he held his own last year with the elite running backs. Now, he had like 11 or 12 touchdowns last year, which I don't think he's going to do that again. His touchdowns have kind of jumped from year to year. He's had years of 3 and 4 and 5, and then he's had years of 11. I think he had a year of like 17 with Philadelphia. So his touchdowns are not dependable, his touchdown production. But I would say you can probably count on him getting 7 or 8 this year. It may fluctuate a little bit. He may get a little less. He definitely has the ceiling for more. But I would say you can probably count on 7 or 8 from him this year. Now his strength of schedule is the 10th easiest. So, a little bit above average. Not great, but it is, I guess, where it's at. And it's better than, I guess, being at the bottom. But his injury risk, again, is extremely high. He's right up there with Le'Veon Bell in the 80s for injury concern of landing on an injury report. So there's always, obviously, the concern of that. But he's definitely a running back that's going to get a high amount of production. He's going to get, a lot of red zone looks probably this year compared to previous years with Buffalo. And, I just really like him this year. And he was efficient last year, and just in that Buffalo offense where he's at, it just projects to be pretty good for him this year. And I think he's a clear-cut 3 for me, out of this list. There may only be 3 spots or 4 spots in the overall rank between my running back 3 and my running back 4, who we'll talk about in a little bit. But for me, it still seems like a pretty big jump down in production and what I can expect and consistency. So I guess that's what I've got to say about McCoy. Might as well not, keep dragging it on any further. And I'll move right on to my running back number 4, which is Devonta Freeman from Atlanta. Now, I know there are a lot of people concerned with Devonta Freeman, and having Tevin Coleman on the same offense, and what will that look like? Will Coleman be stealing his carries, his receptions, that kind of thing, like he has in the past? Kind of limits Devonta Freeman's upside, that kind of thing. But it's clear that Atlanta sees Devonta Freeman as its running back of the future, as they just signed him to a massive contract this offseason. Meaning, when Coleman's contract is up, he'll be able to go get paid somewhere else, because I'm having a hard time seeing Atlanta signing him again. I do think Coleman does limit some of Freeman's upside, but at the same time, when it comes to the red zone, it was Freeman all the way last year. He got the ball 84% of the time when they handed it off in the red zone, which was second highest in terms of red zone usage behind Melvin Gordon, who is at 85%, so not much. He got 53 targets in the red zone last year, which was second only to David Johnson. Again, he's looking at probably another 240 touches or so this year, so it's not like he's not getting a lot of production or a lot of opportunity in the offense. Atlanta is a high-powered offense, and while they will likely take a step back from last year's historic offensive season, you're still looking at a lot of touches and a lot of opportunity for players in that Atlanta offense, and especially Devonta Freeman. Last year, in terms of efficiency, he was pretty good. He scored the ball 35% of the time. He touched the ball in the red zone. The thing that I don't like about Devonta Freeman is his game-to-game consistency. His game-to-game consistency is 25.64%, which the next highest running back is Jay Ajayi, which we all know as a very, very inconsistent back. But then again, you have to go quite a ways in order to find a running back that was that volatile, I guess, in game-to-game. The next running back for me that was that volatile, it was Mark Ingram, with 35% game-to-game consistency, and he's down in the late 30s for me overall, which is actually quite a bit higher than most people have him. He's being drafted kind of in that 40 to 50 range. So I actually like him more than others do. But still, my point being, Devonta Freeman is one of the most inconsistent backs in terms of fantasy production compared to, the other people that are around him and where he's being taken. Right now, he's being taken, kind of the middle of the first round. 7th pick of the first round or so is his ADP, according to Fantasy Football Calculator. He faces the 25th hardest or easiest schedule for running backs. So what's that? 7th or 8th hardest running schedule for running backs this year. So not exactly a favorable schedule, but in terms of injury concern, he is very reliable. Very reliable. In fact, he got a 12% chance of landing on an injury report, according to Sports Injury Predictor, which is incredible for a running back. You have to kind of figure the baseline for a running back is in that 30 to 40 range, just based on the the hits they're taking, and especially for a starting running back, you're kind of getting hit from all over, and you never know what could happen. But 12% is pretty good. To say the least. In fact, it's one of the best running back injury in terms of injury risk that I have in my top 10 running backs. The only other one under 20% is Todd Gurley, which you would think, having torn an ACL in college, be a major concern, but he's proved pretty reliable these first 2 years with Los Angeles. In terms of risk, I guess, for Devonta Freeman, he's pretty safe. I think one of the things that I like about Freeman is he's got a pretty reliable floor for a running back. It's not like, he runs the danger of being outside of running back 24 even when completely healthy. But he doesn't have the full upside, I guess, of some of the other guys in the top 10 might have. But he runs in a high-powered offense, again, in Atlanta. High targets in the red zone, high efficiency, that kind of thing. So I feel like I'm sounding like a broken record at times, but really that is what you're starting to look for when you're looking for elite running backs in fantasy production. You need a high amount of targets and you need efficiency. Because in the case that they don't get as many targets as you would think they're going to get, they still need to be just as efficient in order to at least give you a reliable floor. For me, that's why Freeman is there at number 4 for me. We'll move on to another running back that I don't think is maybe will have as high of a floor as Freeman, but I like his potential at number 5 in running back Jordan Howard. Now, Howard ran last year for like 1,300 yards in like 13 games. Now, he's surely not going to run with that efficiency. He had like a 5.2 yards per carry efficiency, which was remarkably ridiculous. And he got the ball 67% of the time when they ran the ball. You look at his touches, he'll probably get 260, 270 touches. He's not going to catch the ball a whole lot. He's not a pass catching back, but he got the ball quite a bit in the red zone. He had 31 targets last year, was efficient with those 31 targets. You're looking at probably 200 points or so in terms of projection, which is a little bit below Devonta Freeman, who I have projected right now 214 points. Now, Howard does have a lower floor this year. He could score down to the 160, 170 range. And he was 20% for game-to-game consistency, which was better than Devonta Freeman, but worse than all the other running backs so far. But the thing that I think draws me to Howard is things that also want to push me away from Howard. And he's been the running back I think I've had the hardest time so far this offseason trying to figure out where he should be in terms of fantasy. Because you look at his strength of schedule, he's got the 8th easiest strength of schedule for running backs. He's only 23 years old. He has an injury concern of about 20%, which is really good. He's not wildly inconsistent like a Jay Ajayi. And then you look at his situation. Chicago's got one of the top 5, maybe one of the top 10 offensive lines for running the ball in the entire NFL. Then you look at the offense, and there's not really much else to run the offense through but Jordan Howard. So you know they're going to have to rely on Jordan Howard in order to succeed on that offense. You've got Cameron Meredith. You've got Kevin White. That's about it. Alshon Jeffrey left during the offseason. Your quarterback, Jay Cutler, retired and has now signed with Miami. So now you've got Mike Glennon and Mitchell Trubisky at quarterback. Now, I like Trubisky in the draft, but I don't think he's ready. You get put in a situation with 2 quarterbacks that have never started a full season in the NFL. And you're probably going to get a game plan that relies heavily on the running back to take some of that pressure off the quarterback. So you've got good blocking. You've got the likely targets. He's going to be a centerpiece of the offense. What's there not to like? But then you look at it and you go, well, yeah, but there's nobody else in the offense. So what's going to stop the defense from just loading the box and coming, 8 strong at Jordan Howard? And how is he going to perform with that? And surely he's not going to keep up his 5.2 yards per carry that he had last year. So, his efficiency isn't going to be the same this year as it was last year. But he's got a full 16 games. He's got one of the best rushing lines. He's going to be the centerpiece, but he's going to face more fierce defenses. And there's always the dreaded sophomore slump, so to speak, with fantasy running backs. And I don't remember where I saw it. It might have been PFF or somebody like that that put out the sophomore slump running back statistics. And the 4 running backs that had ran for over 1,200 yards their rookie year and their fantasy production the next year. And it was like a 17% drop in fantasy points. And so they were talking about, Jordan Howard and how is that going to affect him and all of that. But, you look at if you would have played all 16 games, started all 16 games last year, he would have scored, he would have ran for 1,600 yards and probably 8 touchdowns. So you take a 15% cut from that, and you're still talking a sizable sum of yards. I mean, he's still going to run for over 1,000 yards at that rate, and 5-6 touchdowns, which granted isn't a lot of touchdowns for a season for a running back, but it's still good enough that you say, well, if you're looking at a 15% regression for Jordan Howard this year compared to last year, that's still probably a running back 5, running back 10 potential. And that's the floor. His ceiling is, honestly, I believe his ceiling could be running back 3. I really do believe that behind Le'Veon Bell and David Johnson, you could see Jordan Howard at running back 3 this year. Now, things would have to go his way, and he would have to keep up a lot of that efficiency that he had last year. But when he's behind one of the best lines in the NFL, and he's going to be getting those targets because who knows how well they trust their quarterbacks, it's possible. I know there's a lot of people that would probably call me crazy for saying that statement. And it sounds outrageous if you took it at face value. But when you look at the situation he's in, when you've looked at how he's performed last year, and you see the potential that's there in terms of the usage, there's nothing not to like. I don't know. This is why I've been so conflicted on Jordan Howard, and he's been the one guy that I never know what to do with, because you look at both sides of it, and there's red flags that say don't draft, and there's flags that are green flags, so to speak, that say like he could break out and be a great player this year. So where do you draw that line, and which ones do you trust? So for me, I guess I have him sitting there at 5. I could see anybody making the case for him being down at running back 7, 8, 9, and I could see somebody making the case all the way up to running back 4, depending on how you feel about Devonta Freeman. I guess that's just where I sit with him. Is I kind of have him towards the higher end at 5, but it wouldn't surprise me, if I look and watch and decide to move him down farther or up 1 or whatever. But that's where he's at. So let's move on from Jordan Howard and move on to running back number 6, Melvin Gordon. So I don't really know what to do with Melvin Gordon. I've kind of got him and my 7th running back really are like 6A, 6B. And the only reason I have Melvin Gordon this high is because of his potential. Last year he was extremely inefficient. He ran the ball for only like 3.7 yards per carry, but had a ridiculous amount of touchdowns that kept him sustainable, I suppose, for the fantasy season last year. Now, if that touchdown production stops, he's not that good of a fantasy running back in terms of top 10 production. You're looking at maybe a running back 2. But if he can keep up his fantasy touchdown production, then maybe he's worth being up here. He's got the potential to be, again, a top 5 running back. And I guess that's probably why I have him at 6. It may be a little overrated for him, but he's got potential, and touchdowns are the things you look for in fantasy. And so when you've got that touchdown potential like he has, it's worth noticing and trying to take advantage of. Now, he'll probably have similar carries and touches as Devonta Freeman had in that 220 range, 230 range. And again, like I said, Melvin Gordon got the ball 85% of the time in the red zone, which is remarkable. And that's why he had so many touchdowns last year, and why he was able to be sustainable is because he got the ball every time they got down there. And he was extremely efficient when he got the ball in the red zone. He scored 52.9% of the time he got the ball in the red zone, which again is just absolutely remarkable. In terms of projection, I've got him at 194 points this year. He's pretty reliable. In fact, he's right around the David Johnson level of consistency for game to game, 14.9%. And so again, he was dependable last year, but that all depends on his touchdown production this year, and he's not going to get the same amount of touchdowns this year as he did last year. That's just not sustainable. But the question is whether or not he can become more efficient running the ball than he was last year. With injury concern, he is an injury concern. He's one of the higher running backs that I've got in my top 10 In fact, he's behind only LaShawn McCoy, Le'Veon Bell, and my number 9 running back, who you'll find out about shortly, who's actually already been injured this offseason. But Melvin Gordon is middle of the pack for strength of schedule. He's got the 15th easiest right now, or I guess 17th hardest, depending on how you want to look at it. He sits, right in that average, but was just an inefficient runner last year, and I think that will bounce back a little bit. And you've got an offense that has an extremely good passing game with Phillip Rivers, and you just drafted Mike Williams, and you've got Keenan Allen back, and there's definitely, that takes some of the pressure off Melvin Gordon, and should also open things up a little bit for Melvin Gordon throughout the year, which should help with his efficiency in running the ball. So I guess that's where I've got him, is at 6, kind of 6A, I guess. But he's got potential. I also think he's one of the running backs most likely to be a big bust this year in my top 10. I would say he's probably the second most likely of my top 10 to finish outside of, running back 36 range or running back 24 range without being injured, of course. He's a lower floor, but the potential for a higher ceiling, especially if he brings that efficiency back up. So that's where I've got at 6A. So number 7 for running backs, which I guess is 6B, is DeMarco Murray. Now, there's been the concern that DeMarco Murray is going to lose his touches to Derrick Henry, and, there's no worth in drafting DeMarco Murray because the Titans drafted Derrick Henry last year in the 2nd round, and, surely he's going to start taking over, and it's going to be his team, and DeMarco Murray is just going to be old and whatever and back up. That's not happening anytime soon. With the Titans' workhorse running back offense, they are going to run DeMarco Murray into the ground until he retires from the NFL, or so it seems. He's going to get, again, a high percentage of carries. You're looking at 240, 250 touches in terms of both receiving and running the ball. He got the ball 75% of the time in the red zone, so it's not like Derrick Henry's that big of a concern for the red zone. He was pretty efficient with those touches in the red zone. Again, I actually have him projected to score just as many points as Melvin Gordon at 194, but with a little bit of a higher floor than Melvin Gordon has, with maybe a little bit lower of a ceiling. Game-to-game consistency, again, was reliable at 17.33%. You could depend on him for, a chunk of yards. And you look at, his stats for last year. He played 15 games last year. 14 of those games he was a running back 2 or better, which is pretty good. And 11 of those he was a running back 1 or better. Again, that's one of the better scores for any of these running backs outside of Ezekiel Elliott, Le'Veon Bell, and David Johnson were really the only 3 that were as good as him. So thinking about it, DeMarco Murray might be a little underrated at 7 at running back for me. I think it's just the limit of the floor. He's in a good offense to be able to be productive, but he's turning 30, which is, you're starting to get that limit for running backs most of the time. There's always, the occasional Frank Gore who seems to be played in his 34th season in the NFL, still running for 1,000 yards. But he's getting there in terms of age, and so there is obviously that concern. There's a little bit of an injury concern for him, 58% for injury concern for me is where I have him marked for the odds of landing on the injury report this year. But he looks to be good and probably underrated for where he should be. It's just, he'll be that reliable running back 1 that you need, that you can take a higher upside guy with running back 2 and take, a little bit of a shot on him. And you can depend and lean on Murray as your running back 1, which is what I like for my running back 1, which is why I tend to avoid guys like Melvin Gordon or maybe a Jay Ajayi as my running back 1, because they're not somebody that I can bank on giving me a solid floor each week. So I guess I like Murray, and maybe in a week or so, as I start to reevaluate my rankings again, or in a couple days or whenever that is, Murray may jump Gordon and has the potential to jump Howard. It's just that looking at that, he's that guy that you want as a running back one in terms of dependability. With that note, we will move to my running back number 8, which I'm sure a lot of people have been wondering where he was, why he's not on my list. And here he is showing it up at number 8, the suspended Ezekiel Elliott. Now, before Elliott's 6-week suspension was handed out by the NFL, I actually had Elliott pretty close to Le'Veon Bell, which I feel like wasn't necessarily the case. I mean, he was the number 3 across the board, but I had him a lot closer to Bell than I think most people probably did. I liked Elliott a lot last year, and I made the mistake of not picking him and letting somebody else take him, and I went, oh yeah, I can get a good bargain on Lamar Miller, and we all saw how that worked out for me. But I do really like Elliott again this year, like I did last year. In 2016, he got the ball 65% of the time. Again, you're looking at probably, before the suspension, you were looking at 315 to 330 likely touches, which is really good. So when he comes back in week 8, you can expect some high-end fantasy production from Ezekiel Elliott. And he will be coming into the playoffs, a reliable running back for you to be able to use. But the problem is he's out for the first 7 weeks, 6 games, and then they have their bye in week 6, I think it is. If you take Elliott, you have to have a plan on how to supplement that for the first 7 weeks. You can take Darren McFadden, but you've still got to have somebody for that other week. Derek McFadden should be good, and they've still got a good line. It's not as good as last year. They've lost a couple guys, combination of free agency and retirement. And you also look at, Ezekiel Elliott and his red zone usage, and you can depend on Elliott to get those short yardage probably a little bit better than you can McFadden. Now, Elliott last year ran the ball 38 times in the red zone, or got targeted 38 times in the red zone, and was one of the most efficient running backs at that in the red zone. Has a good market share. He was even more consistent than David Johnson last year. I mean, he had a 13.55 game-to-game consistency percentage for me, which is remarkable, meaning that 87% of his points came within the standard deviation of what you'd expect him to score in any given week. So he's one of the least volatile players in fantasy football. And he's only 22, and he's got the 9th best strength of schedule in the NFL this year. And the fact that he's that consistent is worth a shot for the final 9 games of the season, including the playoffs. Now, I wouldn't take that shot too early, because you have to figure out how to balance that with production at the running back position for the first, 7 weeks. So I probably don't look at him until the late second. And I've heard some people, the fantasy footballers, for instance, talking about, Elliott, and they didn't think they would take him until the early to mid 3rd round, which for me, I'm willing to take end of the second if I'm confident in getting a guy that I think can supplement his absence for the first 7 weeks. It definitely limits his upside at the fantasy position. Now, there is the potential that his suspension gets shortened to 4 games, in which case then, of course, you're jumping on a little earlier, and we'll see that as it kind of plays out. I think the NFL from today has a week or so to rule on his appeal. But, as we saw with Tom Brady, who knows what can happen. And that's the risky part of Ezekiel Elliott, because what if with his appeal, he gets the opportunity to play earlier in the season, right? So say he starts week 1 and he can play the first 6 weeks as the appeal is going on, if it's dragging on and on and on like Brady's did. But then say you get to week 9 and the appeal is ruled upon and he's suspended for 6 games. Now he's out weeks 10 through 15, and you've essentially lost him for the playoffs. That's the risk you run with Ezekiel Elliott. And that's why I think some people are more cautious with him and where they're taking him. But for me, the potential upside of that, of him coming in and being that fantasy producer, if I can survive the first 7 weeks without him, I think there's the upside to that. But now let's move to my number 9 running back, Jay Ajayi. So Jay Ajayi, I don't quite know what to do with him. He's kind of like Howard for me. Part of me looks at Ajayi's statistics, and it was somewhere in the range of like 50% of his yards last year came in 3 games. Now, he had like 415 yards or something like that against the Buffalo Bills alone in 2 games last year. So, when you run for 1,100 yards, but 400 of those are against one opponent, it's hard to see sustained success with that. For me, he's a lot like Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen obviously not as explosive as Jay Ajayi, but in terms of production and the percentage of yards coming in, a low number of games. But Jay Ajayi, most of his production came from three games. And same with fantasy. I mean, a lot of his points that he scored, most of his points and why he ended up where he did last year came from 3 games. Ajayi had 65% of the carries last year. He's looking at probably another 250 touches this year, and Adam Gase has already said in the offseason that they want to get Ajayi more passing opportunities, or receiving opportunities rather, in the offense this year. And so, that only looks to add to even more carries or more touches than he had last year. Now, he was extremely efficient in the red zone. His projection for me is in the 187 range, but he's got an extremely low floor for me. In fact, there's not many players that have a lower floor in my top 15 than Ajayi does, because if he's as volatile as last year, which for me, the game-to-game consistency was 37%, which is ridiculously high. If he's that volatile, and doesn't have those big games again this year, he's going to be a big bust. And he's the guy that for me is the most likely to end up outside of the top 36 running backs at the end of the season when he's completely healthy. He's that risk. And the injury risk isn't all that great at 70%. He faces a slightly below average schedule this year. So he's a guy that could make or break any given week. For me, I will look at Ajayi if I already have another running back that I can depend upon. If I have a running back 1 that I can depend upon, I will look at Ajayi. Now, Ajayi right now is going towards the middle of the second round. You're talking 3rd, 4th, 5th pick of the second round. So unless you're at the back end of 1 and you've already taken a Jordan Howard and for whatever reason want to pass up on a wide receiver, maybe, like a Jordy Nelson if he happens to fall there, which if he happened to fall there, I would love. Maybe a Michael Thomas, a T.Y. Hilton type wide receiver. And if for whatever reason you want to go double running backs to start, Ajayi would be a good second running back, because you'll have a basis with your running back 1, you'll have a floor, and then you have a potential to just boom any given week with Ajayi. But he's not a guy that I'm willing to depend upon week in and week out as my running back 1. I just haven't seen enough that I trust it, and he's had a concussion now this offseason as well. And so there's the questions with that, and it's just a lot of risk for me to make him my running back 1. But let's move on to the 10th and final running back in my top 10, a man who I think saw an increase in potential for production this year in Todd Gurley. So Todd Gurley for me has a little bit of a bump up than I've had him previously in my rankings. And that comes from the Sammy Watkins trade. Because of Sammy Watkins, defenses can't load the box all the time and take on Gurley. They've got to be prepared for Sammy Watkins as well. And the Rams also added Robert Woods this offseason. They've still got Tavon Austin, who now is looking to be their 4th wide receiver, as reports are coming out that Cooper Kupp looks wonderful in Los Angeles. You always take the glowing reports with a grain of salt in the preseason, because you never know if they're trying to use that to motivate a player or whatever. But there's things that have been said about Kupp, like he's one of the most brilliant rookies that they've ever worked with, one of the hardest working rookies that they've worked with, that kind of thing, that really starts to stand out. And as you watch the preseason, we'll kind of see how much they trust Cooper Kupp with things in the passing game, as we see a little bit of the starters, and we'll see when he comes in as well, and how many times they target him, that kind of thing. We'll kind of get a feel for how they want to use him. Right now, the indication is he'll be the starting slot receiver over Austin, and Austin will just be a gadget player, kind of like Cordell Patterson was here in Minnesota. So the Rams' offense is looking like they're getting a few more weapons. Now, the problem is they still have Jared Goff throwing the ball to those weapons, and so that doesn't make things easy. But in terms of supporting cast, Gurley's got, some pretty good players around him that can hopefully take a little pressure off of him. Now, Gurley's a player that has a really good floor. He is going to get carries. He's going to get touches in that offense, and there's not a whole lot that's going to stop him besides injury. He had one of the highest usage rates last year in the NFL for running backs. He nearly topped 70%, and his touches will probably be behind only David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell, David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell, and LaShawn McCoy. Those will probably be the only three running backs that have more touches than Todd Gurley does this year. And that's just because he's the only guy in the entire backfield, it seems like, that has any talent. Again, high red zone usage rate, good efficiency with that. My projection for him, he's not going to be a real high ceiling player. I really don't think. And while he wasn't necessarily the most consistent game to game, he also had a decent enough floor that you didn't have to worry as much as, his reputation might be coming from last year. And I think he's being drafted on the low end right now. He's being taken kind of in the middle to the back of the second round. That's probably pretty fair. You might put him in the beginning of the second. It all depends kind of where you're wanting to go with running back. He's going to have the floor without, the high-end potential of some of the other guys around him. Low injury concern. He's still only 23 years old, but he's got a pretty bad schedule in terms of run defenses he's going to face this year. He's got the fourth or fifth hardest defense schedule this year for running backs. But again, with Sammy Watkins and with Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp, hopefully they can take a little bit of that edge. And if Jared Goff makes improvements this year, could really help with Todd Gurley's efficiency and ability to run the ball. So I probably like him maybe a little bit more than most. He's not a high ceiling player, but he's not a low floor player either, I guess, for as cliche as that sounds, I guess. I like him enough that I'm willing to put him at 10, over a guy like Leonard Fournette or Lamar Miller or, anybody like that. I guess I like him enough to put him at 10. So that's my top 10 and where I have them. I just want to touch on a couple quick sleepers. I'm going to hit on one that I really like in the middle rounds that is being extremely undervalued. And I'm going to hit on one in the later rounds that I like as well. But first, I want to address the middle round man that is being slept on like he has for seemingly the last 5 years, and that is Colts running back Frank Gore. He's not a flashy pick. He's not a guy that has the potential to put up 25, 30 points in a game. But he's consistent. He's the lead back. He gets the carries. And he's a guy you can depend on, if you need to as a running back 2 or at a flex spot or whatever that is. He's a guy that you can bank on if you need to. And that's why I like Frank Gore at his current ADP. He's being taken in the middle of the late 7th round, more towards, I guess, that middle of the 7th round in a 12-team league. I like him there. He's a guy, again, you can depend on. And there's been all the hype of, Robert Turbin, and, that's been hyped for the last how many ever years, and it never does anything. And then they drafted Marlon Mack, but Marlon Mack's more of a scat back. He's not going to be that reliable carry kind of guy like Gore is. I don't think Gore's going to lose a whole lot of his touches again this year. He will lose some, probably. He'll keep going down in terms of touches, but it's not going to be nearly as much as people seem to be thinking it's going to be. So for where he's being taken at, I like him a lot. The final guy, and this is a later round guy that I really like, is somebody being taken in with the last pick of the 13th round, and that's the Oakland Raiders, DeAndre Washington. Now, of course, Marshawn Lynch is there in Oakland, but Lynch is 31. He hasn't played football in a year, and he didn't look that great the last year he was playing football. With a guy that size that runs the way he does, there's always the concern for injury. And at some point, his body is going to start being worn down, and they've already said they're going to try to limit him to 200 carries this year. So if Lynch goes down, Washington, based on what happened last year, Washington will probably be that number one guy. Now, he's going to share some time with some of the other backs. It's not going to be, he's not going to be that workhorse back for Oakland. But he is going to be the guy that's going to get the majority of the carries there in Oakland should Lynch go down. And again, he looked pretty good last year when he ran the ball. He was pretty efficient. He's a guy that that I could see trusting, especially should Lynch go down. Now, I'm not saying handcuff, because I'm not a big handcuff guy. I don't think if you draft Lynch, you should take Washington for the sake of handcuffing. But Washington is a guy that I like a lot in that 13th, 14th round that has the potential to be a starting back in the NFL with if Lynch goes down, and could even play a significant role even if Lynch is playing, depending on how much they're limiting Lynch in games. He's got a little bit of that, the combo of could make an impact without an injury, and then with an injury would become a solid player. So he's a guy that I would say look at and target later in rounds that I like a lot, and that's where that's at. That will wrap up this week's episode of Fourth and Goal Fantasy Football Podcast. Thank you for listening. And of course, as always, you can find us on Spreaker, YouTube, iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud. Go ahead and get on and subscribe to us there and follow or whatever to make sure you're getting all the up-to-date podcasts. We really appreciate you listening, and make sure you join us again next time on the Fourth and Goal Fantasy Podcast.